They said making deals with Israel and Africa was political suicide. Lobbyists warned me. Businessmen threatened me. And even my own advisors whispered that I was gambling with my life. But 3 minutes ago, I signed the decree. Every Israeli deal in Burkina Faso is blocked, not postponed, not renegotiated, blocked. And Netanyahu is stunned. His embassy has sent urgent cables. His ministers have demanded clarification. And his companies have called in favors they've been stockpiling. For years, I answered them all with one sentence. Africa is not for sale. Do you know why this moment matters? Because for decades, Israeli corporations weren't just signing contracts here, they were embedding themselves into the very veins of our continent, mining concessions disguised as partnerships, telecom networks that doubled as surveillance grids, agricultural projects that stripped farmers of their land under the false promise of development. They thought we were blind. They thought we were too desperate to care. But we saw everything. Last month, my intelligence service handed me a dossier thicker than a Bible. Inside were blueprints of Israeli-backed infrastructure projects, roads that led straight into mineral-rich zones, satellite dishes wired into foreign intelligence hubs, and contracts signed by leaders who never told their people the true price of those signatures. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office staring at those papers until the desert wind rattled my windows, and the first call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou. And I asked myself the question every African leader must eventually face. Who do you serve, your people or the powers that fund you? What I saw on those pages chilled me. Maps marked with tiny red circles, each one a gold mine, a lithium deposit, a uranium field. But the roads didn't lead to African markets. They led to foreign ports, to Tel Aviv, to Paris, to Washington. Telecom towers dressed in corporate logos stood like steel sentries across our land. Behind their clean branding were systems that siphoned the voices of our citizens into foreign servers. Every call, every text, every private word of an African family was packaged and sold like a commodity on markets we would never see. Irrigation projects spread across satellite images, fields that should have fed our children, fenced off instead, guarded by men with foreign accents, harvested for export. Farmers who once tilled that land became day laborers, working their own soil for wages too small to buy bread. And the most chilling part, these weren't isolated cases. It wasn't one deal, or 10, or even 50. It was a network, a spiderweb stretching across 17 African nations, every thread leading back to the same hands. They thought Africa would never piece it together. They underestimated us. They always do. But I did piece it together, and once I saw the full picture, I knew there was no going back to the comfortable lies of partnership and development. The more I studied those documents, the clearer the pattern became. Every Israeli project followed the same blueprint: enter through humanitarian channels, establish infrastructure under the guise of aid, then slowly transform that infrastructure into intelligence-gathering apparatus. In Ghana, they built communication towers for rural connectivity. Within 2 years, every phone call was routed through servers in Tel Aviv. In Kenya, they installed agricultural monitoring systems to help farmers optimize crop yields. Those systems were in fact tracking population movements and mapping resource locations with military precision. In Mali, they established tech training centers for young Africans. The real purpose was to identify and recruit local intelligence assets, while mining data from every device that passed through their networks. The pattern was too consistent, too methodical, to be random corporate opportunism. This was systematic intelligence colonization, orchestrated at the highest levels of the Israeli government. And what truly shocked me was the cooperation of Western allies. French companies provided the legal frameworks. British firms handled the financial structures. American corporations offered technological support. They were all feeding from the same trough, dividing Africa's digital sovereignty among themselves like colonial powers carving up a map. The pressure came quickly from every direction. First, the lobbyists arrived at my doorstep. Men in expensive suits came to me with teeth too white and smiles too rehearsed. They promised consequences if I dared interfere with their partnerships. They spoke of economic isolation, diplomatic troubles, and mysterious accidents that had claimed leaders before me. Then came the businessmen offering contracts worth billions, shares in multinational corporations, and Swiss accounts that would keep my family rich for generations. When I refused to even hear them out, their charm slipped. Their tone turned cold, menacing. One leaned across my desk, his eyes hard as stone, and said, "Mr. President, you're playing a game you don't understand. The rules were written long before you were born. When seduction failed, the threats grew louder. Whispers of coups spread through diplomatic circles. Reports of assassination plots surfaced in intelligence briefings from allies. Even some of my closest advisors, men I had trusted with my life, pulled me aside in trembling voices. Slow down, Mr. President, don't provoke them. You've seen what happens to African leaders who challenge these powers. Gaddafi is dead. Sankara is dead. No one fights Israel and survives. But they had forgotten something. Something no amount of steel, money, or threats could erase. I wasn't raised in palaces or educated in foreign universities. I didn't grow up at banquets where Africa's resources were discussed like stock options. I grew up watching my mother count coins for bread, her weathered hands trembling as she stretched every franc. I grew up watching my father's hands crack and bleed in the gold mines while foreign trucks rolled past our village carrying away riches he would never touch. So when they told me this fight was impossible, I asked, impossible for who? For the men who profit from our silence, or for the people who have nothing left to lose? 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief, Colonel Sawato, entered my office with a folder that would change everything. His face was grave, his usual composure shaken. Inside were communication intercepts, financial records, and satellite images that revealed the full scope of what we faced. Mr. President, he said as he placed the documents before me, this goes beyond anything we imagined. Israeli-backed companies weren't just doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping our mineral deposits with military precision, recording our political meetings through compromised telecoms, and tracking our citizens with facial recognition, systems we never approved. But the detail that ended all hope of diplomacy was this: they were sharing that intelligence with multinational corporations. Our own data, our lifeblood, was being weaponized against us, used to negotiate better deals for foreign powers while chaining us deeper into dependence. That night, I didn't leave my office. The dossier lay spread across my desk like evidence at a crime scene. Ordinary papers, contracts, maps, spreadsheets, yet to me, they looked like shackles. Chains around my people's necks, chains dressed up as development. Outside, Ouagadougou slept peacefully, unaware that their digital footprints were being harvested and sold. Children dreamed in beds their parents could barely afford, while foreign servers stored their biometric data for future exploitation. At 5 a.m., as dawn painted the sky, I made my decision. I picked up the secure line and called my generals. "Wake them up," I ordered, my voice steady. "Today we cut the web." General Cabra asked for operational details. I gave him only 2 words that would define the next chapter of our nation's history: no mercy. 2 hours later, while most of the city still slept, our forces moved with surgical precision. 17 targets, identified after months of surveillance, struck at the same time. No warnings, no negotiations, no chance for evidence to vanish. By 7 a.m., the spiderweb that had taken decades to weave was tearing apart. The first strike hit a sleek telecommunications building on the eastern edge of town. From the outside, it looked like any modern office: corporate logos, tinted glass, employees arriving for another day of routine business. But when my soldiers entered, what they found inside would make international headlines, though few media outlets would dare tell the full truth. Server rooms stretched wall to wall, humming with machines powerful enough to monitor communications across half the continent. Rows of humming machines stood before us, each one a digital parasite feeding on the private lives of our people. Hard drives stored the personal data of more than 2 million Burkinabe citizens, their locations, their relationships, their most private conversations, all neatly cataloged and prepared for transmission to foreign intelligence services. At the second sight, the truth grew darker still. It was a warehouse in the industrial district, outwardly branded as a humanitarian storage center. Signs outside promised emergency relief supplies and agricultural aid. But when my soldiers forced the doors open, they found no food, no medicine only. Rows of surveillance drones. Hundreds of them. These were not harmless commercial drones. They were military-grade platforms coded to track rural populations, designed to watch farmers and villagers who had no idea. They were living under constant electronic eyes. The operation manual we uncovered was written in Hebrew, and the targeting coordinates matched precisely with our richest agricultural zones and mineral deposits. By 9 a.m., 6 more facilities had fallen to our coordinated assault. Each one revealed the same pattern, polished facadas masking espionage operations. Development projects that developed nothing but foreign intelligence networks, 8 organizations that aided no one but their masters. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and for the first time in decades, Africa held proof of what many of us had long suspected. But I knew that proof alone was not enough. Documents could be buried, narratives could be twisted, the global media machine could spin our revelations into misunderstandings. No, the world needed more than accusations. It needed decisive action. At noon, I entered the press conference hall where cameras from across the continent waited. The lights blazed, microphones hissed with static anticipation, but I did not hesitate. I looked directly into the lens of the main camera and spoke words that would echo across Africa and beyond. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects, and we are certainly no longer your blind spot. But I wasn't finished. The moment demanded more than sound bites. It demanded truth, spoken with conviction. For too long, we have lived under the language of partnership while enduring the reality of exploitation. We have signed contracts, written in boardrooms where no African voice was present. We have welcomed development projects that developed everything except African prosperity. Today that ends. Every Israeli intelligence operation in Burkina Faso is shut down. Every surveillance network built under false pretenses is dismantled. Every contract signed in bad faith is null and void. Those words were not just for my people. Though they roared in the streets outside, they were meant for Tel Aviv, for Paris, for Washington, for every capital that had treated African sovereignty as optional. By evening, the shockwaves were undeniable. African phone lines burned with activity. Embassies demanded explanations, their voices tight with panic. Western media outlets condemned my actions as radical and destabilizing. Israeli envoys begged for private meetings, promising to clarify misunderstandings behind closed doors. But I had no intention of hiding in smoky backrooms, where our dignity had been bargained away for generations. So I repeated my decree, loud enough for every village to hear. Every Israeli intelligence operation in Burkina Faso is terminated. Every surveillance contract is cancelled, effective immediately. It was like thunder rolling across the continent. Within 24 hours, the ripple effects spread. In Bamako, Mali, university students painted murals of my words across cracked walls, adding their own calls to defiance. In Conakry, Guinea, fishermen's cooperatives declared they would no longer sell their catch to companies with Israeli ties. In Dar es Salaam, women's organizations pledged to review every foreign partnership for hidden surveillance. This was not organized. It was not coordinated by the African Union or any government council. It was instinct. A continent that had been silent too long had heard an echo of its own voice, and this time, it refused to let it die. That same evening, the calls from other African leaders began. Mali's president, Ibrahim, reached me on the secure line. His voice carried both relief and steel. "Ibrahim," he said, "we've uncovered similar operations in Bamako, Israeli companies, communications equipment feeding directly into foreign servers. What do we do? Shut them down?" I told him without hesitation. All of them. Today, hours later, Guinea's military leadership reached out through encrypted channels. They admitted they had been monitoring suspicious Israeli activity for months but had feared the diplomatic fallout of acting on it. I answered their hesitation with one sentence: stop worrying about diplomatic incidents. Start worrying about digital colonialism. By the end of the week, for West African nations had frozen Israeli military technology imports. 6 more had launched emergency audits of foreign-backed infrastructure projects. And behind closed doors, the African Union was entertaining something never before attempted: a continental strategy to counter foreign intelligence infiltration. But here's what truly rattled Netanyahu's government. This wasn't just about Israel anymore. The evidence we uncovered pointed to something far more disturbing. There was systematic cooperation between Israeli operatives and the intelligence services of France, Britain, and the United States. Our telecommunications infrastructure had not been compromised by one rogue power. It had been penetrated by a network of allies, sharing African data like colonial powers once carved up territory on 19th century maps. For decades, they had treated Africa as a free intelligence zone, swapping information about our governments, our resources, even our people, as if our sovereignty were a footnote. That realization cut deep. I understood then that we weren't only fighting Israeli overreach, we were confronting the same colonial mindset that had never truly ended. It had only traded gunboats for fiber optic cables. The betrayal was breathtaking in scope. French companies had drafted legal frameworks that disguised surveillance as legitimate regulation. British firms had engineered financial systems to launder intelligence funding under the cover of commerce. American corporations had supplied technological platforms marketed as civilian progress, but laced with military-grade monitoring capabilities. They had turned Africa's digital development into a Trojan horse for permanent surveillance. And yet, even as I absorbed the depth of the conspiracy, I watched a new spirit awaken across the continent. Grainy cell phone footage reached me: farmers in Niger chanting my name while burning fake development contracts. In Ghana, crowds filled Independence Square holding signs that read, "Africa is not for sale, and our data, our choice." In Johannesburg, thousands marched through the glass canyons of the financial district, their voices echoing against the towers of multinational banks. Then something happened I never expected. Inside the usually ceremonial halls of the African Union rooms where leaders often hid behind scripted platitudes, men and women began to stand. One after another, they demanded the same thing: we must review our deals, all of them. It was like watching a dam break after decades of pressure. For generations, African leaders had bowed their heads when Western powers entered the room, convinced resistance was impossible. Now, at last, they were rising, not just for Burkina Faso, not just for me, but for themselves and their people. The morning after our operation, an Israeli diplomat called me in fury. On what authority, he demanded, do you act against legitimate business operations? I told him exactly what authority I had: the authority of a sovereign nation that refuses to be spied on by foreign powers wearing the mask of economic development. But the call that truly mattered came 2 days later. Benjamin Netanyahu himself requested a private line. The man who built his career on projecting unshakable strength was now forced to address an African military leader directly, President Traoré. He began, his voice carefully measured. I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding regarding our activities in your region. I let steel sharpen my reply. Mr. Netanyahu, the only misunderstanding was your assumption that we would not notice systematic surveillance, disguised as development aid. He tried to protest, to dress his defense in familiar rhetoric that Israeli companies were creating jobs, building infrastructure, advancing African progress. It was the same old script of denial and deflection. I cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Netanyahu, I said coldly, when you build infrastructure that spies on the very people it claims to serve, that is not development. That is occupation with better marketing. The silence that followed my words was heavy, almost physical. For several seconds, the line carried nothing but the weight of truth spoken directly to power. Finally, Netanyahu broke it. These operations provide valuable intelligence that protects regional stability, he said, abandoning the pretense of development work. Whose stability? I asked. The stability of governments that sell their people's privacy for foreign investment, or the stability of people who deserve to know when their lives are being monitored. The call ended after 12 tense minutes. Netanyahu never called back. But his government's reaction came swiftly and predictably. Israeli media accused me of destabilizing the region and sabotaging democratic partnerships. European newspapers filled their pages with warnings about radical leadership in West Africa, questioning my authority and labeling me a threat to order. These were the same newspapers that had never once asked why foreign intelligence operations were apparently legal in African states to begin with. Yet while Tel Aviv scrambled to manage the fallout, something extraordinary unfolded in the streets of Africa. Leaked transcripts later revealed Netanyahu slamming his fist on the cabinet table, demanding to know how this boy dismantled decades of strategy in one morning. But he misunderstood. It wasn't just me, it was the people. It was the miners who refused to load trucks carrying gold to foreign ports, the students who rejected textbooks that taught them inferiority, the mothers who swore their children would never inherit digital chains. On the evening our operations ended, thousands filled the streets outside the presidential compound not to protest, but to celebrate. Young people lifted signs that read, "Our data, our choice, and African information for African development." University students held teach-ins on digital sovereignty, explaining how surveillance had disguised itself as modernization. Even my critics, who usually attacked every word I spoke, admitted the truth of what we had exposed. Opposition leaders stood before cameras and declared, "Whatever our differences, with President Traoré, we stand with him on African digital independence." That unity, more than any military action, terrified our adversaries. For the first time, they saw that African resistance was not dependent on one man or one government. It was becoming a continental consciousness. The most important validation came not from crowds, but from quiet rooms. African leaders who had long endured foreign interference in silence began reaching out privately. Presidents, prime ministers, and generals shared fragments of intelligence their own agencies had uncovered. Piece by piece, a fuller picture emerged: systematic surveillance and data extraction spanning the entire continent, a network too vast for any one nation to confront alone. That was the moment I understood what needed to happen. We required something Africa had never built before: a collective intelligence doctrine, designed by Africans for African interests. Over the following weeks, I worked with 6 West African nations to draft what we called the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. It was not just a policy document, it was a declaration of independence in the digital age. Its principles were simple, yet revolutionary: total transparency for all foreign investments in telecommunications and data infrastructure, no hidden clauses, no secret agreements. Full audits by African-controlled oversight bodies, no exemptions for national security or proprietary technology, zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activities, any foreign operation unable to prove its civilian purpose. An African benefit would be terminated immediately, no grace periods, no diplomatic appeals. Continental cooperation in monitoring and responding to interference. What threatens one African nation threatens us all. Mandatory data localization. African data must remain on African soil, stored in African-controlled systems. It was, in essence, a line in the sand. Africa would no longer be a playground for invisible empires. African data must remain on African soil, stored on African servers unless explicitly authorized otherwise, by African governments for transparent, limited purposes. And here was the principle that shook Western capitals the most: African digital infrastructure exists to serve African interests first. Foreign access is not a right, it is a privilege, one that can be revoked at any time. Netanyahu's government dismissed our framework as unrealistic and dangerous. Israeli ministers warned that Africa could not survive without their technology, their expertise. They predicted collapse, economic ruin, technological isolation, diplomatic irrelevance. But they were wrong about everything. Within 3 weeks of implementing our digital sovereignty protocols, new partners came knocking. China, Russia, India, Brazil, all eager to work under transparent terms. Even some European companies, desperate to distance themselves from their competitors, began branding themselves as digital sovereignty compliant. The world had no shortage of partners who could do business without spying on us. The market was rewarding transparency, punishing surveillance capitalism, exactly as we had hoped. The ripple effects were breathtaking. Morocco passed new restrictions, requiring explicit citizen consent for any foreign data collection. Kenya audited every international telecom contract and uncovered hidden monitoring systems. Nigeria mandated that all foreign companies keep Nigerian data on Nigerian soil under Nigerian law. Even South Africa, usually cautious, declared openly African digital infrastructure must serve African interests. And then came the validation no one expected. American intelligence officials, speaking privately to African diplomats, admitted they were being forced to reassess their own practices, not because they wanted to, but because our framework was inspiring the global South, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Pacific nations, all studying Africa's model, all demanding the same protections. The dominoes had begun to fall, and the global intelligence networks were watching the nightmare they had feared most become reality. But the greatest shift was not in policies or treaties. It was in the minds of Africa's young people. Across universities, students studied the digital sovereignty framework as a foundational text. They organized conferences on technological independence. They pressed their governments to reject any partnership that compromised African autonomy. To them, digital sovereignty was not radical. It was common sense, as natural as defending their physical borders. They could not understand why their parents had once accepted surveillance as the price of development. 6 months after Operation Clear Sight, I can say this: Burkina Faso's digital infrastructure is stronger, safer, and more transparent than at any point in our history. Our internet speeds are faster, freed from the hidden drag of surveillance systems. Our telecommunications costs have dropped, no longer inflated by foreign monitoring. Our data sovereignty has been restored, every citizen's information stored on servers under African law. Most importantly, our people know their government protects their digital rights instead of selling them. The predictions of collapse were lies. Investment in our telecommunications sector has risen, not fallen. African companies, once sidelined, now employ thousands more as they replace foreign spy operations. Technology jobs in Burkina Faso have grown by 40% in half a year. Meanwhile, Israeli firms once entrenched across Africa are being quietly locked out of market after market, not because of hostility, but because they refuse to meet the transparency standards that are now becoming the norm. Netanyahu built his African strategy on one assumption: that African leaders would always trade long-term sovereignty for short-term profit. That assumption is collapsing, and the cost to maintain it grows higher by the day. So when international headlines screamed controversial about my actions, I smiled. Controversy is often nothing more than truth wrapped in courage, and courage is exactly what Africa has lacked for too long. The lesson for African leaders is clear. Technological independence is not only possible, it is profitable. Digital sovereignty does not isolate you from the world. It gives you the power to engage with it on your terms. And the lesson for foreign powers is even clearer. The era of assuming African consent is over. We are not the continent that says yes to everything out of desperation. We are not the market that accepts exploitation because we believe we have no choice. We are the continent that demands respect, transparency, and reciprocity. If you cannot meet those standards, there are others who will. This is not anti-Western sentiment. It is not anti-Israeli prejudice. It is pro-African pragmatism, born from hard experience and cold analysis. We welcome partnership, but only with those who treat us as equals. We reject, absolutely and permanently, any relationship built on deception and surveillance. Netanyahu's government could have chosen differently. They could have chosen transparency. They could have asked permission instead of assuming forgiveness. They could have treated us as equals instead of targets. They chose otherwise. And now they live with the consequences. Our choice has already been made. We choose sovereignty. We choose transparency. We choose an Africa that owns its digital destiny. Benjamin Netanyahu learned this lesson the hard way. He will not be the last, because the age of African digital colonialism is ending. And what comes next will be defined not by how Africa adapts to the world, but by how quickly the world adapts to Africa. This is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is how we reclaimed our digital independence. The future belongs to those brave enough to defend it. Africa is not for sale. Not our land, not our resources, and definitely not our data.